Hello and welcome everyone to Being Messianic. My name is Gail and we are looking at the Hebrew roots of our faith. And today we are actually looking at the Passion Week. We are looking at we're looking at 24 hours of Jesus' life and all that happened during that time and how many biblical prophecies were fulfilled during that time. It's quite a stunning amount. We know that just within a 24-hour period of his life, that between 25 and 33 prophecies were filled. It depends upon which studies you go by, which things you go by. We know, and I've talked about this before, that we know that there are over 300 prophecies about who the Messiah and who he would be, what he was going to do, and there were so many prophecies about this. And today we're going to dive into all of the 300 a little bit more next week. But today we are looking at 24 hours, just 24 hours of his life, and how amazing it is that so many things were fulfilled in that short amount of time. How God came together and so many miracles happened in just literally 24 hours. When we look at that, it's just a stunning amount of time that all this happened. So, as I said, it's just a dense cluster in this time. So when you think about this mathematics about this, it's quite incredible that any of this could have happened this way. So one of the things we're going to be looking at just briefly today, and we'll look more next week about, is Dr. Peter Stoner. He was the former chairman of the Departments of Mathematics and Astronomy at Pasadena City College. And he worked with 600 science math students, to look at what are the mathematics. Could you take some of the scriptures, some of the prophecies, and could you mathematically prove that Jesus was the Messiah? And one of the things they were doing, they were aiming to quantify the statistical improbability of Jesus' life being just a coincidence. To ensure the results were beyond reproach, they were instructed, all the students were instructed as they were helping on this, to be extremely conservative in their estimates. So as we look at these numbers, these are very conservative estimates. You're only seeing the OCC screen. Okay, thank you so much for that. I'm glad you said that. That's what I wondered about. Okay, hopefully now you can see, can you see the scope of the slide set? Okay, thank you so much. Okay, when I asked if you were able to see the screen, I should have been specific. I apologize for that. But with the scope of this, it's amazing when you think about how they just used a lowball calculation. And by doing this, for one example was the Bethlehem example. They didn't use the world population when they were calculating the prophecy that he would be born in Bethlehem. And this was from Micah 5:2. They didn't just look at the world population. They calculated the odds of one person out of the average population of Bethlehem throughout history. So they weren't looking at all of the people in the world. They were just looking at the city of Bethlehem. And when you take that, it really gets amazing because, as I said, they went very conservative. So when you look at the findings, he broke the calculations into stages to keep showing the mounting improbability. He decided to go with just 8 prophecies. So the probability of one man filling just 8 specific prophecies, that is, like, for example, being betrayed by 30 pieces of silver or having his hands and feet pierced, that was calculated to 1 in 10 to the 17th power. Okay? That's a lot. So he used the illustration, and this is how he decided to make it so it would be understandable. He imagined the state of Texas covered in silver dollars about 2 feet deep. If you mark one coin, just one coin, and the whole state of Texas is covered. You stir the whole mess up, and you ask a blindfolded man to pick out that coin with the X on it at the first try. the odds of him being able to do it is 1 in 10 to the 17th power. Well, then we start looking at when you increase the prophecies up to 48, the odds jump to 1, they go up even higher, of course, by doing this. And this takes it to 1 in 157 power. So 1 in 10 to the 157th power. The reason this is so amazing, when you think about 1 in 10 to the 157th power, this visualization of it, this number is so incredibly vast. It exceeds the number of atoms in our known universe. So there are the probability and a low ball number for this being true, for 48 prophecies of Jesus, is actually more than the number of atoms in the universe. And we know that there were over 300 prophecies that Jesus fulfilled. We know that there was between 25 and 30 within the 24-hour period. When you think of that, that's astronomical. I mean, that's just amazing how improbable that it wasn't. And when we're looking at the 24 hours, think about this. So you're thinking 25 to 30 prophecies from a single sunrise to sunset period in 24 hours, just 24 hours of his life. And they had to be fulfilled in a set order. They had to be in an exact order according to the Old Testament. So we can think of this like as a crime scene. If we were going back and being a detective and looking at this as a crime scene, was this the truth? Did this actually happen? Pretend you're a lawyer or you're looking at a crime scene, and can you prove this? And what's interesting about it is whenever you're looking at this, many people will say, oh, well, he could have made them happen, or I've heard the disciples could have made this happen. Well, not exactly, because a lot of it, the things like the betrayal price, the gambling for the clothes, the Roman execution method, those were controlled by his enemies. So you can't manufacture these stories, and you cannot make this happen. These are things that had to happen by the will of God. So is Stoner's math any good? Well, yes. So what's interesting is that it is over 82 years ago that he did this. It was reviewed by the American Scientific Affiliation, and they looked at it, and it's been researched many times. It's looked at over and over again to prove whether or not that it's still true. This math is over 8 decades old, but it's the standard reference for those studying the statistical probability of the Passion Week and looking at those markers, forensic markers we're talking about. It's considered the standard for looking at it, because, like I said, he didn't cook the numbers to make them higher. He actually made them a lot less, and he tried to find a way to make everything at the lowest mathematical number it could be, rather than what I would have done, which would have been the number that it should be. So he was trying to make this so that it would stand up to skeptics throughout time. So let's look at the 24-hour period. Okay, so we start with Thursday night. And we know that it was predicted he would be betrayed by a close friend. We know this from Psalms 41:9. And we know that Judas was at the Last Supper, and then he leaves to betray him. We know that the price is specified in Zechariah chapter 11, verse 12. Okay, we know that it's 30 pieces of silver, because that's where it's also been established in the Torah of what the price of a slave is. And he was sold for the price of a slave. And the result, we also know that the money would be thrown into the house of the Lord and given to a potter. And we know this from Zechariah 11:13. We know that Judas, he realizes what he's done and how bad this is, and he throws the money back to the priest and gives it back to them. And they can't put it back in the coffers because this would be a bad thing. So they turn around and they use that money to buy the potter's field where the poor would be buried. So then you have the early Friday morning. We know that there's the trial. In Isaiah 53:7, Jesus we knew that he would be quiet. He would be oppressed and afflicted, yet did not open his mouth. Well, Jesus remained silent before Caiaphas and Pilate. So he came as the quiet lamb. Last week we talked about a lamb and why a lamb. Why a lamb is a sacrifice. And a lamb goes humbly and meekly, and this is what he did. Then we know that there was the physical abuse. It was predicted that he would give his back to those who beat him and his cheeks to those who plucked out his beard. We know this from Isaiah 50, verse 6. And we know that the Romans did these things to him. We know that there was the physical abuse was there. Then the spitting. It was predicted he would not hide his face from the mocking and spitting in Isaiah 50:60. And yet there was the fulfillment we see in Matthew 26:67. We see all of these things coming true. And then we have Friday morning, the piercing. Over 1,000 years before the event, they pierced my hands and my feet in Psalm 22:16. So Psalm 22 was written centuries before the Romans even had invented crucifixion as a form of execution. It did not exist when this was written. So there is no way when David wrote that scripture that he would have known about crucifixion. He wouldn't have known that it would happen that way. There was no way. The thirst. It was predicted he would be given gall for my food and vinegar for my thirst in Psalm 69:21. We know that the soldiers did just that. They offered him wine mixed with gall on a sponge. And then the gambling. Again, this is not something he could have done. They predicted that they would divide my clothing amongst and cast lots for my garments in Psalm 22:18. And we know that the Roman soldiers did this. They gambled it. They didn't tear his clothes, which was common. They ended up gambling for his clothes. And then the death. One of the things we talked about with the Passover lamb is that the bones can't be broken. No bones can be broken for a Passover lamb to be the ultimate to be a sacrifice. And Jesus being the ultimate sacrifice, no bones could be broken. So we know that from Exodus 12:46 that there is the requirement for a lamb. And we know that in Psalm 34:20, not one of his bones shall be broken. We also know that Jesus was already dead. He'd given up the ghost. And while the Roman soldiers broke the legs of the other two that were hanging at the same time, the two criminals, he did not break Jesus's legs. They didn't do that because they saw he was dead. Instead, they went ahead and stabbed him. And this is when, the blood and fluid came running out of his heart area when they did that. And then we have the burial. It was predicted that he would be assigned a grave with the wicked. So, when somebody died, they would turn around and just throw them into they would be buried as a criminal. They would be thrown into a mass grave type thing. And instead, his body, Joseph of Arimathea, who was rich, asked to have the body, and he put it into his tomb that had not been used. So you can see that these are things that could have been done. And you can see from the Old Testament, the scriptures, where you have the passion cluster, where you have the shepherd was struck, the sheep were scattered. Well, we know in the New Testament that the disciples flee when Jesus is captured. We know in Psalm 35:11 that their false witnesses rise up against him. There was false testimony at his trial. We know that. In Isaiah 53:12, he was numbered with the transgressors. He was crucified between two thieves. In Psalm 21:2, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus' fourth cry was from the cross. It was prophesied, and he used the exact wording. He used the wording that was in Psalm 22. In Zechariah 12:10, they will look upon the one they pierced. And then this is what I was saying, where they pierced his side, that they didn't break his legs. So why is this such a big thing? When we talk about a crime, and we can talk about this in legal terms. So when we talk about that, we talk about a chain of custody. For one or two things to happen, it might be a coincidence. But in this case, there was 25 plus specific details. many things say up to 33. There are many sources that'll say there were 33 specific things that happened. So from the exact number of coins to the specific treatment and the final resting place in a rich man's tomb, and to what all happened from one sunrise to one sunset is where we get Peter Stoner's mathematical astronomical probability. You can see this mapped out in a 24-hour time frame, and it shows how we can fit this all together, because you have the physical evidence, as we talked about, we have the financial trail, the 30 pieces of silver, and we have the execution. So we have these forensics markers that show if you were investigating this as a cold case detective, you would be looking at this and you would be following all of these and having this in a set order. So we have the motive. We've talked about in the past about why did the Pharisees and Sadducees want him gone? Well, there was a lot of money in the temple. There was you'll have to go back and listen to what I talked about in the past about the temple and how much money was being in there. In fact, we even have the prophecy Jesus gives that not one stone would be left unbroken. And that happened because there was so much gold in the temple and so much money going into the temple that the Romans, after Jesus' death, I think it was about 30 years, if I remember right, off the top of my head. But after his death, they did burn and sack the temple. They set it on fire so that the gold would melt. And then all the gold melted into the cracks of the rocks, and they broke all the rocks up. That's a lot of money. There was a lot of money. You'd have to go back and listen to the whole thing about how much money I calculated coming out of the temple. But there was a lot of reasons why the priests and the Sadducees and Pharisees and the scribes did not want to give up their roles and did not want to admit that Jesus was the Messiah. But on top of that, you also have the payout. It isn't just a random piece of number, 30 pieces of silver. That's a very specific amount. We also know that Judas doesn't keep the money. We know that we talked about that. And we know that there's the scene in the house of the Lord where Judas throws the coins back to them. And we know that from Zechariah 11:13 that what's going to happen. So we know that this happens. And this is happening not with Jesus, but with his enemies, those who betrayed him. Judas who betrayed him and the leaders of the temple. So then you have the assault, the actual crime itself. So let's do an autopsy of that. So this autopsy, the things that we knew were going to happen, all of this prophecy was written 700 to 1,000 years before he was born and died. So if you look at the crime scene and what we knew about it, and what they prophesied and what we see, it actually matches Roman records of how they did this. And there's a lot of Josephus and other writings tell about what happened to Jesus. So it wasn't just the Bible, and it wasn't the disciples and the followers just saying it. There were other people that tell the story as well. So we knew that there was a lot of blunt force trauma. And we knew that this would happen. And he said, I did not hide my face from mocking and spitting in Isaiah 56. And we knew that there was the scourging. I gave my back to those who struck me. We saw that from Isaiah 50, verse 6. And we know that this is where the Romans were using the whip. And they would use the whip to... they did this before Jesus carried the cross, and he carried the half part of the cross that they carried. And all of this happened. We know that these things happen. And then his hands and feet. It's very specific. That is super specific about they pierced my hands and my feet in Psalm 22:16. When David wrote this, the Jewish the method of execution at the time, they would stone people to death. They did not do this hanging them on a crux or cross. They didn't do this. So this was invented by the Romans 800 years later. So there is no way that when this was written that David would have known that. So again, there's the all these environmental factors. So as you look at a crime scene, you're looking at all of the factors that the victim couldn't control. We know the clothing, we know that he was crucified between two people, and we know that his bones weren't broken. So all of these things are very, in our logistic crime scene, these are key markers we would be looking for. And then, of course, we talked about that he was buried, he should have been buried with the wicked, but he wasn't. He was buried where the rich were buried, into Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. So that's quite different than what we would see. So you can see as you go through it that there's these things of how we match it up with the scriptures that we match it up to. So there's a very specific order that happened, and it all happened within 24 hours. All of these things were going on. Now there are more. If we look through the whole time of when he was on trial and when he died and all of that, there's even more, but we're only looking at the 24 hours. So you can see that there's a statistical improbability. You realize he couldn't fake this. No man could. You would have had to control the exact amount of money his enemies paid his betrayer. You would have had to control the Roman government's decision on which type of execution was going to be used. You would have had to control the soldier's decision to gamble instead of tearing his clothes. And you would have to ensure he died before they broke his legs. So this is why researchers like Peter Stoner concluded this couldn't be just a story, but it was a mathematical footprint that was left in history. So that's, then you can go on to, I'm not going into it, but as a forensic investigator, you can even go into the missing body case, where the evidence behind matches the pre-written script of the prophecy where Jesus would be resurrected. That is another way to go into this. So we can look at the crime scene. There's no way, like I said, there was no way to do this because you couldn't control any of these things. There's just a total statistical probability that we couldn't ever do this. So when somebody tells you that they don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah, or they don't believe any of this could have happened, well, you're arguing with math here. You're arguing with a whole thing that had to happen. In a typical death, the chain of custody ends with decomposition, and we have this body and that it's decomposing, and we can tell how long it decomposed. However, in this one, you don't have that. So now you have a biological anomaly, and this is what I'm saying. You can actually go back through and follow this even further and keep going with this, and Jesus kept fulfilling more prophecies. Because you can see where you will not leave my soul in Sheol, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption in Psalm 16:10. And so you have the forensics math. The prophecies have a time limit. So in the ancient Near East, it was believed that the soul left the body and began to decay after the third day. By rising on the third day, the body of Jesus bypassed the biological process of corruption. So Peter Stoner used this exact forensic point in his first public speak. Peter, the disciple, I got this mixed up. Peter, the disciple, used this exact point in his first public speak in Acts chapter 2, verse 27 through 31, when he argued that King David did decay, but Jesus did not. So you can see how, and then Peter Stoner used all of this as his mathematical formula of showing how this went on. Peter Stoner actually went further with this than what I'm doing in the 24 hours, but he goes even further with it. And you can see in the 4 days in John 11 that the decay, you can see Jesus, a good example. I decided to pull up a good example of the 4 days. And the account of Lazarus, we know that he died and was dead for 4 days in John 11. And if you look at this as an example, because according to Jewish tradition at the time, the soul was believed to linger near the body for 3 days, but by the 4th day, all hope of life was gone. There was no way that this person could be alive, is what it was believed. So Jesus purposely stayed 2 days after hearing Lazarus was sick. And he said, this sickness will not end in death, nor is it for God's glory. And he gets there at 4 days. So by arriving in 4 days, his timeline was legally and physically established. And we have the reality of decay. So you can see how the belief in the timeline of this. And that's why I threw this in here. Because why does the 4 days matter? Why does it matter when Jesus was resurrected? Because in Lazarus' case, for example, it proved that he wasn't just unconscious or in a coma. He was actually decomposing. Jesus, when he raised Lazarus, he demonstrated the authority over hell. And then you have the prelude, because this was the final sign of the Gospels that led to the decision. When they heard this, the Sanhedrin decided this is why they decided to put Jesus to death. It's also believed they were also trying to kill Lazarus because they wanted to erase this evidence. But you can see why this matters. So what about Jesus then? So when we have Peter and John who enter the tomb, they see the scene, and it wasn't what you would have seen if somebody had just stole the body. He saw the linens wrappings lying there, and the face cloth not lying with the linen wrappings, but the rolled up in a place by itself. We know this from John 20, verse 6 and 7. So think about it this way. There were grave robbers, by the way. And if they wouldn't have spent 15 minutes at the scene, especially because there were soldiers guarding it, there was no way they would have spent time to unwrap the body. And there would have been this sticky, spiced corpse that led up to the head covering. They wouldn't have done that. There was no way they would have done that. So then we have the first witness. Okay. A female in that time was not, her testimony was not legally admissible in a Jewish court. Sometimes they would let them speak, but they really didn't hold credence. So yet you have its first witnesses are women. If you wanted to go this and prove this, you would not have picked women to be the ones to do this. But it matches the humble nature of the Messiah's kingdom, choosing the lowly to confront the mighty. So this adds an additional ring of truth to this, because you couldn't make this up. Why would you have the women first? And then you have the wound marks. So we know after the resurrection, we know that, first off, we know that they will look upon me and whom they have pierced. We know this from Zechariah 12:10. Doubting Thomas. I just love Doubting Thomas because he demanded evidence. Jesus he didn't want to just see this healed body. He wanted to see these open wounds. And Jesus said to him in John 20:27, reach your finger here and look at my hands. Reach your hand here and put it into my side. These words remained as a permanent ID card to prove that he was the person that had been crucified. And then we have the forensic signs of Jonah, because he was called, Jesus was referred to as Jonah. So you have the 3 days and nights, and you have the empty tomb. And the body status, there was no corruption. It wasn't decayed. And the body was gone before it decayed. And we also have the piercing, so we know that the scars are there. You know this from the Old Testament, you know this from the New Testament. And then you have the broken scepter. The Roman seal broken and the stone was removed. Yet, who did it? And Jesus had prophesied all that as well as it was in the Old Testament. So when the early Christians say, we don't believe we rose, they say he rose according to scriptures. This is why in 1 Corinthians 15:3 and 5, they say he did it according to the scriptures. He did this because we knew it was going to happen. It was perfect overlay. It was exactly what it was. There is no, when you take the over 300 prophecies, or call them stitches or prophecies, over time, there's no overhang. Every detail fits in this template. They were so perfect. Now you can see why in the early church, why there was no doubt in their mind who he was. And you look at the numbers. So we take the mathematical logical of the 24 hours. You have this dense cluster of rapid fire fulfillments that are occurring in a very, very short amount of time. It's just a small window of opportunity for this to happen. You have this huge compression of time where it has to happen in this time. So it's exponentially impossible. It's impossible for anyone else to have been the Messiah. And we know that these were all very specific. We know from Zechariah chapter 11, Isaiah chapter 53, and Psalm 22. We know that these were very specific. And last week I talked about the lamb. Well, you have the lamb logistics. We know that he was inspected for 4 days. We know that that this is the Passover lamb was inspected. Jesus was also going through all of these times where people were checking to see who he was, and they found no fault with him, but yet they still killed him. We know that his bones weren't broken. So we know that these things, just as the Passover lamb had to fulfill specific requirements, Jesus filled every one of those. And as we said, I use just the Passion Week, just that 24-hour day time period that we're looking at. You're looking at 10 to the 17th power for 8 major ones. So this is even more huge. That's what I'm saying. It's impossible because it cannot happen. So in probability of opportunities, many messianic prophecies could theoretically happen to somebody if you put it over a 70-year lifespan, but you didn't. You didn't do this with Jesus. So you have this. 25 to 33 prophecies were fulfilled in this small amount of time. So this is why we call this the 24-hour Passion cluster in Stoner's prophecies, or his mathematical formula. So again, he said if you had 8 prophecies, then that's 1 in 10 to the 17th power, which is the state of Texas. But again, let's say 48 prophecies. That takes us to exceeding the total number of atoms in the universe. It's impossible. And so, as I said, when you start looking at this and people tell you that they don't see how this could be true, look at the numbers here and see how amazing, and God was so amazing that he had this happen in such a small time. You have all of these things that were controlled by external forces that you couldn't do it in that amount of time. And it's such amazing. The big thing is, if you're going to look at 2 passages, I would suggest looking at Isaiah 53 is the first one, because it's often referred to as the suffering servant, and approximately 12 distinct prophetic descriptions that Christians, as we know, as Jesus fulfilling during that 24-hour time period came to happen. Just one passage, Isaiah 53. When you think about that, it's amazing. So I would encourage you to go back and look at Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22. Because these come so quickly and so rapidly. In Psalm 22, it's often referred to as the Psalm of the Cross because it reads like a first-person eyewitness account of the crucifixion, which is about 1,000 years, 800 to 1,000 years before the event actually was invented. So there are 7 very distinct things that come to mind here. Details that we look at. So we see in the verse 1, my God, why have thou forsaken me? We know that this happened in Matthew 27. In verse 7, we see, and all that see me and mock me, they hurl insults as shaking their heads. We see that in Matthew 27:39, where the crowds and leaders mocked him. In verse 8, he trusts in the Lord, let the Lord deliver him, is what they say him. And the priests mocked him in Matthew 27, verse 43, using those exact words, almost exactly the same words. And then if you jump down to verse 15, my mouth is dried up and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. And Jesus says, I am thirsty, which is fulfilled in John 19:28. They pierced my hands and my feet in verse 16 of Psalm 22. And you can see in John 20:25, the same thing happened. And verse 17, I count all my bones and people stare and gloat over me. When the thieves' legs were broken, Jesus' bones remained intact. We know that in John 19. And they divided my clothes in verse 18. And that happened. Isn't that amazing? Isn't God so amazing? There's also probably the most striking about this one is in Psalm 22, verse 16. They pierced my hands and feet. So just the fact that I told you that they use stoning as the method of death. And that's one that is probably the most, that's Actually, it's referred to as the most amazing one when you look at these, because there's no way that David knew this. So what's interesting is that Psalm 22 doesn't end in death. By the end of Psalm 22 and verses 27 and 31, all the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord and will serve him. The future generations will be told about the Lord. So when Jesus said, "It is finished," on John 19:30, some scholars link that to the sentiment in Psalm 22, "He has done it." Isn't that amazing when you think about all that? So today, I was kind of thinking about like foods, and I went ahead and did a combination here. If you were going to do any culinary connections, I was thinking I've explained about the bitter herb salad. When you're doing Passover, we have the bitter herbs, and so we look at that. Salmon is also something that not salmon, but fish would have been very common. So if you were going to make a dinner tonight, I would suggest this, and you make the flatbread. Because why flatbread? Because we just got done with Passover, and Passover we have unlimited bread. And I found a recipe called the 30 pieces of roasted potatoes, and I thought it was so cool of how they did that. I just thought it was an interesting way to look at the different dishes. So we are in the counting of Omar, which means that we're going from Pesach or Passover to Shavuot. And so we have to count the weeks to get there. And this is counting the Omar, where we're counting the time where we're going to it. So as you look at a root word for today, kum means to rise, to stand up, or to be established. And I thought it was a perfect one of our root words to look at because it means to rise, to stand up, or to be established. And what does this 24-hour period tell us? Jesus rose up and stood, and we know he's yet to come. And what a cool way to end of standing up. So I thought this was a great way for us to end this today. And as I said, we're in the series, and next week we're going to be looking at stitching the Gospels. So one of the things I also started looking at as I started praying about it and thinking about it and researching this, and could you take all of those 300 plus prophecies, and could you make the Gospels? Yes, you can stitch the Gospels together, and we're going to be talking about that next week, how the prophecies show up in the Gospels. The problem is you would not have all of Jesus's teachings in there, but you would have the prophecies in the 4 Gospels. They are just packed filled with these prophecies, and we're going to be talking about that. So then we're going to be going through the next weeks of who Jesus is, the reality versus the myth. We're going to be looking at some modern things that have happened, some research that's happened, and again, improbability of things that are happening. And then we'll be ending with Shavuot, and how do we celebrate Shavuot? So I'm going to open it up first to the elders to see if they have any thoughts about the days of this, and then we'll open it up to questions. I think Cynthia, I think may be the only one here today.
Yes, Teresa's here as well. Awesome teaching. Thank you so much. This is so awesome and detailed to go step by step to be able to see it. I like the forensic part of it. This was very good, Gail. Thank you so much.
I know the Lord tends to have me look at things a little differently. So here you go. All right. Um, like I said, I think the biggest reason I think the Lord's having me look at these things is because more and more we're probably going to have people that are going to say, that, oh, this Jesus isn't the Messiah. I think you can look and see that there's no way he's not the Messiah. And we need to recognize him as that. There is no way he's not. It would be impossible for anyone else to have been the Messiah. Anyone else have any comments or questions? Shelley.
I thought this was magnificent. I love this. And Before I came to OCC, I had never heard a minister or preacher talk about that David was a prophet, right? It's in Acts 2, I think it was, where Peter said, being therefore a prophet, and he was referring to David. And I'm just amazed by how the Lord led David with through these Psalms, these about the 800 years before crucifixion even existed, before that punishment was invented. And that was something so new to me just a few years ago, because I never realized that David was a prophet through song. I mean, God is astounding. And so I just wanted to share that, because this is more reiteration proof of that, David was prophet. So I think that is incredible. Thank you for this today.
Well, you're exactly right. That God is amazing. It's amazing the way he takes all of this. And David did have prophecy, and there was all of the things came true. And that's the thing. Next week we're going to be looking at what we've looked at what is a prophet, but we also next week we're going to be going it through the 300, because there's 300. There's over 300 prophecies about Jesus, of who he would be and what he would do. So we're going to go spend a little bit more time on that, because there's a lot to deep dive, obviously. And there are lists out there you can go and look at if you so desire of the prophecies. I've only looked at a few. I have to admit I haven't dug into all of them, but I've just been the ones that have really been led to go through. I just think it's so important that we focus on who Jesus is. You know what? What's really cool about this to me, what the most amazing part about all this to me is, when this happened, when we had the first church, the very first church, they did, like I said, about they believed that he was fulfilled, they believed in Jesus because he fulfilled the scriptures. They knew that. And over time, we've gotten away from that. But we're also told in the end times we would know more things. And now we're looking at this. We have computers, we have calculators, we have science, we have math, we have all of these things. And we can go back and look at the prophecies and look at the things and go, whoa, every one of these came true. And we also know from Scripture that if one thing doesn't come true, if we know from the Old Testament that if a prophet tells one thing it doesn't come true, then you're not to believe any of the prophecies. How do you account for all of these different prophets telling about the Messiah, and yet all of these came true? There's no way that it could happen unless it was God. There is no way any of these things could happen. And for me, that is just so astounding that God is so good that he shows us these things, and he's showing us. And as people start doubting and when the Antichrist and things start happening, take comfort in the fact that, because you now know there are over 300 prophecies that Jesus fulfilled. He fulfilled 25 to 33, possibly even more, but 25 to 33 definitely, just in the 24 hours that he was put on trial and when he died and was in the tomb. Just in that little tiny time frame, how many came true? And then, of course, there's so much more when he was resurrected, and the days after that. There's so many more that came true. How wonderful is that? Marion.
Yeah, Gail, that mathematical probability is just amazing. And as you were talking, I was thinking, I say, well, God knows what He's doing, and He had to do that thing to make them realize that this wasn't a man thing. This was God and his amazing ways of bringing this about. And then you were saying there's still 300 other prophecies that's there, behind this. It's just amazing. And when you look into it, and you listen to what you're saying, you can see that this could only be done by God. Man could not do this. And I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed that. It's like I said, I mean, all the glory and honor goes to the Lord because I'm so glad that he pointed this out to me and that I found some of this in my reading and research and things. And I found this. I think one of the things too, is, as I said, in the end times, you're going to have more and more people that are going to come out against, and you do now. You have people that come out and say that Jesus is not the Messiah, is not real. And that's when you have the hardened hearts. You can present all this evidence to some people and they're still not going to hear it. And that's always been fascinating to me, that there's so much evidence of who he is and so much more. Because I remember as a kid being told, oh, there's nearly no evidence, we take it on faith. Well, no, we don't have to take it on faith. I mean, there's evidence that who he said he was. I do take it on faith. I take it on faith, but yet at the same time, the Lord revealed all of these different things and all this research. And the fact that this was done, this Stoner's math was done over 80 years ago. Next week, we're going to look at some other things, what has been done. Stoner is the most famous, but there are other things where people have studied, and there's a lot of very recognized math and science for all of this, of how these things happen. I didn't even get into the archaeological evidence. There's other evidence and things like that of all of the things that fulfill these prophecies. There's different things that show all of the things that really did happen. All of these things happened. And that's just so amazing to me that God is so good that he shows us those and shows us beyond a shadow of a doubt. All of you that are here are Christians and you already believed. But now there's even the proof for what we already believed. And I just think that God is so good and so wonderful that he allows us to see that. Any other questions or comments? Well, I hope you're enjoying this. And like I said, next week, we're going to look at the 300. We're going to look at the Old Testament and what was fulfilled in the New Testament. We're going to be looking at that. And we're going to do a little bit more of a deep dive into some of those prophecies. I wanted to start with just the fact because of this 24-hour period, because so many, when I found out that so many prophecies were fulfilled in just a small window of time, it amazed me. I was just astounded that so many happened in that time. So, like I said, many people believe it's 33. It's between 25 and 33 prophecies that were fulfilled. And we're going to talk about why there's a different number. We're going to talk about that next week, because you have to go by what sources and the scriptures. I'm just going to simply say scriptures don't always, they talk about something, but they don't always say he will be killed this way. They don't always say it that way. And so that's why there's varying views on how many of these scriptures fulfilled. And that's why there's, like I said, there's many people say there's a lot more than 300. And that's where it kind of becomes this, how do you look at the scriptures? And as I said, when Peter Stoner and his teams were looking at this, they wanted to look at the harshest critic and what they would say if they looked at this. They were trying to look at the lowest probability number. And he himself, Peter Stoner, recognized that this was probably very lowballing, totally lowballing the numbers. He said that in his work. He said that, that this is much lower than what I'm thinking it could be. But we want to use the most mathematical pure number that he could come up with, and that's why he came with what he did. And they thought about it. They spent a lot of time researching this to do this. This was, as I said, 600 students were working on this to try to do it. And many more people have worked on it since. And even when I put it into the computer, looking at the mathematical, it matches up. It still holds up under scrutiny. So that's amazing when you think about that. So anyway, I hope this has been interesting to you. And as I said, next week we'll be looking at the 300 prophecies and looking at those a little more in depth as to where they come from, how they came to be. And the other aspect of this is, why is this important? We talk about our Hebrew roots. We talk about the roots of our faith. And one of the things that I would say is probably most important is Jews very much believe that there were prophecies that had to come true in order for the Messiah, for them to recognize the Messiah. Now, they thought that the Messiah would come more as a roaring lion, which we know is yet to come. And they themselves believed, and that's why the early Christians who were Jews said this over and over again, and they would say that Jesus fulfilled the scriptures. He fulfilled the prophecies. He fulfilled our scriptures. And I think that that's important to think about as you look at the Hebrew roots of the Christian faith, is that Jesus was fulfilling the Hebrew roots. He fulfilled the prophecies of the Hebrew faith. So that's where I want to leave it for today. And I want to thank you for joining me. We're going to end in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for allowing us to come together and to learn about what you went through, just a small fraction of what you went through in that 24-hour period. Lord, thank you so much for showing us. You are so great and mighty and wondrous. We give all the honor and glory to you because there is no way anyone else could have ever done this. Only you, God, could do this. Only you. And we honor you. And we acknowledge this. We acknowledge that it is you and by your might, by your power, by your glory that these things happen. And we thank you so much for allowing us to see these things and to hear these things and to just get a glimpse into all of this. How wonderful are you, and how glorious is your name. How wonderful are the things that you've done. And we thank you for that. And as we go through the week, remind us, Lord, of how glorious you are. We want our focus to be on you. We honor you, we worship you, and we glorify you. In your precious, precious name, we thank you. And if we were connected to each other in any way, we ask that those ties be broken so that we remain holy unto you, because you are worthy. You are the worthy Lamb, and we thank you for that. In your precious name, amen. Shalom, everyone. I hope to see you throughout the week and hope to see you at Sabbath service. And again, next week we'll be talking about the 300 prophecies. So, shalom. See you next week.